This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to this, the last of our Old Chapman History Society seminars for 2015. Moving on very quickly. Very happy to welcome Andrew Rudd from the University of Exeter, who is actually, from our point of view, two for the price of one, because as well as talking to us about the Georgian era, he's able to apply the lessons for today from the perspective of somebody who used to work for the Charity Commission. So you're doubly welcome. And all over to you.
Cool, that's very kind. Thank you very much. And yes, thank you to everybody for coming. The paper I'm going to give is at a fairly sort of experimental stage, so I'm sort of particularly keen to sort of have everybody's feedback from those of you who sort of have a sort of developed sort of professional knowledge of sort of voluntary history. The title is "A Charity in the Georgian Era: Lessons for Today." I should just say at the outset what I mean by charity is I'm going to consider that term to mean a range of public and private actions motivated by a desire to help others. And I'm approaching this topic as a topic slightly distinct from poverty and slightly distinct from pauperism, but obviously there is a huge overlap in the approach. So I'm trying to sort of pursue a very sort of distinct furrow using this definition of charity within a field that may be sort of more familiar to us all of the history of poverty and pauperism and so forth. So we'll sort of see how we go with that. And just to explain sort of how I came to be here, as Colin said, I spent some years as the Parliamentary Manager at the Charity Commission for England and Wales, the regulator of charities. And then after doing that, began capitalising properly on my PhD in English and went to work at the University of Exeter, where I teach in the English department. I teach specifically 18th century literature and Romantic period literature. So there are these sort of two aspects to my experience, and this project is a sort of experiment in trying to put them together. So that's sort of what this is all about. So let me just start off. I don't know how clear this is to everybody, and if you can't see anything, I'll try to talk it through.
The alternative is we can sit in the dark.
Or we can sit in the dark. I think we're probably better off with the light, with me attempting to say what's on the screen, so we'll do that. The basic premise of the talk, the starting point, is that I think the history of charity in the Georgian era, most of the 18th century and up to the 1830s, matters again, and has started sort of reviving some basics of questions and concerns. Or, sorry, I should say, I've got it the wrong way round. What I mean to say is, in charity in the Georgian era raises, again, sort of questions that are pressing in our own time. So I'm trying to sort of draw some parallels between what was going on in the history of charitable practice and theory in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, particularly the decades around 1800, which I'll be talking about today. And I see these as sort of resonating again in discussion about charity today. So the starting point, I think, was just the echoes that the period raised. A couple of specific things prompted it. There was a very interesting, I thought, report by Sir Stephen Barb, the head of the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations, taking a very long historical look at the role of charities in providing public services. That's what prompted my interest. And I was also just struck by the fact that charity appears to be playing a bigger role in people's lives again. Here is a chart showing figures from 2014, I think, but it goes back a little bit, showing a rise in the number of people who say they have used the services of a charity, either then or close family or friends. And so the line going up are the people saying yes, they have used the services of charity, and the red line is people saying no, just so that's clear. But I want us to concentrate on the one going up, the people saying yes. So that was another thing. And I was also had an interesting conversation with the man who's going to be, I believe, addressing the 25th anniversary conference, Frank Prochaska, who wrote in his book, reminded us that, he said, reminded us of the degree to which charity saturated people's lives in the past, both givers and recipients. And he said it is difficult to imagine that state of affairs for anybody who has grown up in the shadow of the welfare state. And in a sense, I think he also drew some connections between this sort of high point of sort of charitable activity in the 18th century of a very particular kind, and what seems to be happening again now. It was also interesting in the Bubb report. His approach led him to skim over a little bit the 19th century and the 20th century, which he was presenting as slightly unusual, because in the 19th century, charitable culture that had been the case for very many years was sort of being actively reformed, and then that gave way to the welfare state of the 20th century. And I think he wanted to suggest that the 19th century and the 20th century were slightly anomalous almost, and we might be seeing a return to the more unformed, uncentralised, unregularised conditions, which I'm interested in the 18th century. So my focus is on sort of pre-19th century reform charity. And the basic setup is that, under that system, care for people in need was mainly provided by the parish system, using an uneven combination of what was called outdoor relief, that was charitable relief just administered to people in the community, and indoor relief, the workhouse, the house of industry, or house of correction. And in the 18th century, in this period, there was notorious variation in this system, how effectively it operated around the country. So in some parts of the country, it seems to operate pretty well. In other parts of the country, there are tremendous abuses, which is what the 19th century reforms were targeting. So the historical focus here is on pre-reform culture of charity. Let's just sort of take a long view of the phase. Can you read? You probably can't read this. I'll read it out. Hang on a second. What the period I'm focusing on here is I'm sort of using the contention that this muddled pre-reform system basically existed from 1601 right up to the implementation of the new Poor Law, so-called, in 1834, in terms of legislation. J.R. Poynter, the historian, remarked that, in a sense, there was a continuity in this system because its statutory basis was established in 1601, right up to 1834, with a few sort of minor laws in between, but nothing fundamental, he said. But, on the other hand, there isn't a continuity because the system grew so in such a sort of fecund and proliferating manner. And the quotation here, which I'll just read out, is, "The practice of poor relief in England in the 18th century defies simple generalisation. If the Act for the Relief of the Poor in 1601 remained for nearly 2.5 centuries the basis of the system," here's his point, "it only remained the basis of the system in the sense in which the first cluster of polyps form the foundation of a coral reef." So, over the 250 years or so, we have this sort of image of a proliferating coral reef growing up from the basis of the Elizabethan statutes. I just want to draw your attention to the sort of the organic nature of this image, an image of sort of fecundity, proliferation, even beauty, perhaps. Certainly irregular beauty. And J.R. Poynter is talking us through from 1601 to 1834 in terms of poor law legislation. And as I said in the beginning, there's an overlap with poor law and charity law, but we have to note that the Elizabethan statutes were two-handed. On the one hand, the Act for the Relief of the Poor, which he's talking about, addressed the relief of poverty by public authorities, mainly the parishes, within a largely secular framework. But the other half of the law, the Charitable Uses Act, 1601, the one that I'm concerned with, addressed a whole range of charitable activity by private individuals and institutions, and was reproducing what, until the dissolution of the monasteries, had been a spiritual framework of activity. So the poor law on the one hand was sort of largely drawing on a secular tradition, the charity law on the other hand was drawing on a largely spiritual one. I just want to dwell on this because on the one hand, we have the idea of a continuum, no sort of huge legal changes between 1601 and 1834, that can be disputed a little bit, but largely. But I want to concentrate on the sort of the Georgian high watermark of this old system, right? So think of a very elaborate coral reef. If you want, think of a Baroque or even a Rococo church that's built up to the maximum state of sort of irregular floridity, chaos, ripe for reform. That is the state of charity, I think, by the Georgian high water mark in the years immediately leading up to 1834. And it's possible to trace within the Georgian representations of charity traces of cultural memory. That's one of my approaches, cultural memory, going back to the Elizabethan period, and indeed going back much earlier. So just pursuing the strand of cultural memory, this is going to be difficult to read out, but I will try to do it. On the one hand, this cultural memory that the Georgians are interested in goes back to the Elizabethan legislation, but the Elizabethan legislation goes back even earlier. The charity lawyer and charity law historian Hubert Picarda, to give him his due, drew attention to the remarkable sort of coincidence between a passage from the late 14th century poem Piers the Ploughman, which I'll read out in a moment, and the preamble to the Charitable Uses Act of 1601. So on the left here, which I'll read out, we have the character of Trust talking to a rich merchant about how to obtain remission for his sins and die a happy Christian death. And these are some of the things that Trust suggests to the rich merchant that he can do. And therewith, repair hospitals, help sick people, mend bad roads, build up bridges that are broken down, help maidens to marry or make them nuns. Either of those things fine. Find food for prisoners and poor people, put scholars to school or some other craft, help religious orders, or ameliorate rents or taxes. This is Trust talking to the merchant about how to lead a good Christian life and how to obtain a good Christian death. It's a remarkably practical set of suggestions. Build up bridges that are broken down. Very, very strikingly practical. And Hubert Picarda drew our attention to the similarity between that and the preamble to the Charitable Uses Act of 1601, which we charity law people refer to as the Statute of Elizabeth. And the Statute of Elizabeth talks about the relief of aged, impotent and poor people, the maintenance of sick and maimed soldiers and mariners, schools of learning, free schools and scholars in universities, the repair of bridges again, ports, havens, causeways, churches, sea banks and highways, the education and preferment of orphans, the relief, stock and maintenance of houses of correction, the marriages of poor maids, again, the supportation, aid and help of young tradesmen, that's putting scholars to some other craft, the relief or redemption of prisoners or captives, again, and then there's some incredibly specific point about helping people with their taxes, ameliorating taxes, the aid or ease of any poor inhabitants concerning payments of this tax called 15s, and setting out soldiers and other captives. I think the parallel is quite compelling. So on the right we have the Elizabethan idea of what charity was, very practical set of concerns, what charity was in law, and it's obviously drawing on a much older medieval tradition of this sort of quite established list of quite practical things. So this was one of the sources of confusion which often came up in the Charity Commission, because if anybody has looked at sort of charity legislation, there are these things called heads of charity, which are the basic lists of what the law considers to be charitable. After the 2006 Charities Act, the picture was complicated because all that stuff had "and for public benefit" added onto it, which sort of complicated everything. But basically, the heads of charity, which are still in law in the Charities Act 2011 today, clearly derive from these things. And these Elizabethan things obviously derive from a medieval tradition that found expression in this medieval poem. I remember there was one slightly sort of awkward, well, one of many awkward moments at the Charity Commission when people were trying to get investigative journalism sort of registered as a charitable purpose. And there was confusion because they said, well, look, investigative journalism is obviously in the public interest, and when it's done well, it's for the public benefit and it's generally a good thing. And because of this, we had to say all of that is true. But as your lawyers should have told you, it's not charitable. It's a good thing and we support it, but it can't be legally classed as a charity because that's a sort of closed list. That tradition seemed to be hanging around for quite a long time. And this sort of law on the right clearly draws on an established set of practices. But it's replacing the imprimatur, if you like, of the pre-Reformation Catholic Church with the imprimatur of Elizabeth I. And as you may know, she is often described as sort of in her iconography. She passed herself off as some sort of latter-day Virgin Mary, replacing the Marian iconography of paintings with her own image, and something slightly similar, I think, is going on with the law here. So the roots of the pre-1834 Georgian system go back a very long way indeed, and as I hope to show in respect of Wordsworth, we've sort of retained the cultural memory of the Reformation and the older medieval system. And so sort of moving on here, I just want to sort of zero in on the period immediately prior to 1834. As I was doing my very preliminary research, we discover I was struck by a number of sort of common factors in the debate about charity in the Georgian era and the debate about charity today. I'll run through these fairly briskly. Going back to that Frank Prochaska quote about the ubiquity of charity in people's lives in the 18th century, charities providing a relatively greater range of services and the state providing relatively fewer. Compared to the 20th century system, perhaps, again, very arguable, argue away if you want. And again, in the 18th century, a sort of mixed economy of sort of charitable, private, and public sort of state provision of services and looking after people and caring for the sick and so forth. And of course, in recent times, that idea of sort of mixing everything up and letting 1,000 flowers bloom, as people often say in the charity sector, seems to have revived again. As the sort of third sector sometimes identifies, as sort of contributing to that mix, and the slightly sort of dubious foray of the big society was sort of making similar claims some years ago. So there's the idea of the mix there. And the greater role of charity in people's lives also revived questions that people were having in the 18th century about the pros and cons of charities providing services. Just to give one obvious example of that, on the pro side, charities often say, we're better able to tailor our services to individuals and provide a human touch in what we do. People who are wary of that approach say, but your services are sort of, at worst capricious or irregular or uneven or unfair. So that debate is still going, and that was a debate that was flourishing in the 18th century. It's absolutely everywhere. Who should be sort of looking out for the poor? The early 19th century reformers, of course, were all for evening out the system, the great coral reef that they thought had become too irregular. Similarly, people were divided about whether they supported the idea of charity as a show of benevolence, love, fellow feeling, or whether people were critical of it, saying it in fact perpetuated the problems it purported to solve. And I think we can see some of those debates flaring up again and sort of the public debate about charity. So there are some interesting echoes there. That's the last. That was what I just said. And then one rather specific thing which struck me is that in the period, the 1780s, 90s, 1800s, the backdrop was one of economic strain in Britain. That was one thing. And the second thing, very, very long-running wars going on overseas, which didn't affect the population at home directly, but sort of manifested itself in sort of wounded and dispossessed former servicemen and women appearing in the country and people having to look after them. I may have gone a bit sort of overly specific here, but that wounded, maimed sailors and soldiers are a completely ubiquitous feature of the cultural landscape at the end of the 18th century and 19th century, because it was a period of almost continuous warfare with only a brief respite, the Peace of 1802. So people were very, very conscious of the need to look after people and also of the economic strain affecting the state's ability to do it. And this is the backdrop to much of Dorothy and William Wordsworth's writing, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. The project's going to pursue a couple of making use of a couple of theories of charity that are out there. So this is the sort of approach I'm sort of going to be juggling with. There's quite a Pierre Bourdieu makes the claim, I don't know whether we agree with this, that only a saint can give without owning, that says. Only a saint can give without owning. And Bourdieu and people like sort of Marcel Mauss and other people who have theorised about sort of the symbolism of gift exchange tend to regard charity as sort of part of a sort of moral economy, if you like. That's sort of one approach. Mauss famously said that charity, an act of charity, is actually wounding for the recipient of charity. That's sort of one theory. On the other hand, we have Levinas, who has a very interesting theory about charity as an obligation, a moral obligation on the giver, which struck me as quite an interesting updating of the sort of the pre-Reformation notion that you just must give, no matter what. Don't think about it too much. You just give, help people. You don't think about it too much. Whereas on the other side of the debate, Bourdieu and Mauss will say that that's actually there's a slightly sort of aggressive act in the act of charity, they say. It's wounding for the recipient. And Martha Nussbaum has another sort of take on it, and she sort of writes about the difficulty of achieving a true act of charity. For her, charity has to, an act of charity, a true act of charity, has to involve what she calls total sacrifice. So it has to cost you something real. If you have lots of money, Martha Nussbaum says, the act of charity isn't a real sacrifice because you've got lots of it. You have to make a total sacrifice. So there's another reflection. And I'm also interested in the thing that Raymond Williams picked up on in his work Keywords. He picked up on the fundamental doubleness of charity over the centuries. The term charity could denote Christian benevolence, altruism again, but from the 17th century through the 18th century and on into the 19th and 20th centuries, he noted the flip side of charities, meaning benevolence. Charity could be as cold as charity. That was the dark side of the term charity. This notion that charitable acts were emotionally cold. And Williams wrote that by the 20th century, he's thinking about the 1970s, the term charity was so compromised that modern governments have to advertise welfare benefits as not a charity, but a right, just in case anybody was so sort of mortified by the idea that they might be receiving a charity. So the term had this doubleness to it for hundreds of years, Raymond Williams argued. So, it all links back to the question of whether charitable activity is something to be celebrated or something to be lamented or something to be worried about, which is another question we are asking today. And there's a question mark over the possibility of genuine altruism. Possibly in the Middle Ages they didn't need to address this, because charity in the Middle Ages, as the Piers Plowman poem showed, was explicitly for your own good, for the good of your soul. That was sort of quite explicitly the case. There was no sort of pretense that wasn't the case. And today, we could ask the question, we often sort of worry about virtue signalling as some sort of empty act of sort of benevolence for someone that doesn't really mean anything. But, does that matter? so long as good is actually being done. Does it matter? Right, this one's rather dark, I'm afraid. The 18th century, charity as public spectacle. On the left, we have an image of the Foundling Hospital from 1749, which shows the poor mothers who are trying to get their children. They can't afford to raise their children, and they've gone along to the Foundling Hospital, and the children were admitted by ballot. Some of you may know about this famous system that the Foundling Hospital had. There were so many children who needed to come in, and so many mothers wanted to put their children in, that your child, you put a ball into a bag, and the governors of the hospital drew it out, and if it was white, your child was in and safe, although of course the mother then lost contact with the child. If it was red, you went on a waiting list. If it was black, mother and child was sort of turned out. That's what's going on the left here. And on the right is a rather disreputable actor and failed clergyman called Samuel Jackson Pratt, who I'll talk about in a minute. But one strand of my project is going to examine charity as a performed behaviour in the 18th century, as part of the public spectacle that formed such an intrinsic part of 18th century life. Some of you may be familiar with Jürgen Habermas's idea of the public sphere, the importance of the bourgeois public sphere in the 18th century. This idea that the centre of power and the centre of cultural authority moved out of the court and the church and into a fundamentally bourgeois middle-class domain, which Habermas associated with the 18th century coffee house, a secular gathering place where middle-class intellectuals could discuss culture and start to set the terms of debate for the first time. The Foundling Hospital also functions as part of the public sphere because it was a place that people went to be seen and to talk and to carry out charitable acts in public. It was founded in 1743 by Captain Thomas Coram, who was so distressed to see abandoned babies in the streets of London that he felt impelled to establish a hospital to look after the foundling children. Some of these were orphans, some of these were children who were deposited by the mothers who could not afford to look after them. And it was a type of charity very popular in the 18th century called the subscription list charity. And the subscription list charity, it published all the names of the donors in the order of how much you donated. That's not quite true, actually. I think the royal donors went at the top anyway. And then it broadly sort of followed how much you donated. If you go to the Painted Hall at Greenwich Hospital, you'll know all about it. There's a huge list of the donors sort of painted around the entrance, isn't there? Showing who's given money to support the mariners, the retired sailors whom the hospital was set up to cater for. But this is a very, very public display of charity. Your name and the amount you gave were written down and published and available for public consumption. Everybody could see them. And in addition, the Foundling Hospital and other charities like it was a social gathering place. It was a centre of music and art. George Frederick Handel composed the Messiah for the benefit of the Foundling Museum. Middle class and elite audiences in 18th century London went to the Foundling Hospital to hear the music. William Hogarth and Joseph Highmore and other high society 18th century painters painted images for the courtroom that went around the edge, and it was fashionable to go and be seen and look at the art. This was very much charity as a performance in a public place. Well, they raised a lot of money. This is the question. It's really easy to sort of criticise that, and lots of people who work on it, historians of 18th century charity, criticise this very public form of charity, but they did good in the end. And the author who is most closely associated with this sort of model of charity is this character, Samuel Jackson Pratt, who masqueraded under the ridiculous name of Courtney Melmoth in his youth, when he was a strolling actor with his wife, but then she was far more talented than he was, left him, set up on her own account, and he became a clergyman and a great promoter of charities. So a lot of my work is sort of looking at his sort of charity publications and his charity poems, He was also very active in promoting the work of the Magdalen Hospital for reformed prostitutes. And the sort of thing that Samuel Jackson Pratt would do was write a poem imagining the consciousness, imagining the life, imagining the predicament of, for example, a reformed prostitute, and publish the poem at the end of a series of essays and the list of names of all the people who've given money to that charity. So, again, the work of literature was sort of part of this public performance. And the Romantic authors, Romantic period authors, people at the end of the 18th century, when sort of Samuel Jackson Pratt had become quite notorious for doing this sort of thing, they regarded him as a sort of a buffoon and a rather disreputable figure, because he was sort of touting his poetry around all of these charity dinners, and he embarrassed the prison reformer John Howard by writing sort of endless poetry about how wonderful John Howard was in reforming prisons and trying to raise money for a statue of him to be put up. And John Howard was in fact quite a modest man, and he found this absolutely mortifying. And eventually he sort of told Samuel Jackson Pratt to shove off and sort of take away his poetry. That's John Howard, whose legacy survives in the Howard League, still for prison reform. I should add also that the Foundling Hospital, their work lives on in the Coram Children's Charity, still over at, what's the name of the square? Near the Brunswick Centre, where the charity still is. So lots of the 18th century charities live on. And the Romantic authors attacked Samuel Jackson Pratt because they basically saw him as a sort of meretricious charlatan who was sort of touting his benevolence around the dinner party circuit of 18th century London. And they sort of wrote very rudely against him. Lord Byron attacked him in many of Byron's satirical poems, and the Romantic man of letters Charles Lamb attacked Samuel Jackson Pratt as well, partly for using a title that he wanted to use for his own magazine. That's another story. So there was this character Samuel Jackson Pratt on the scene, the sort of literary equivalent of the subscription list charity. How am I doing for time? But here's one of the paintings. Sorry, this is very... Can I just turn the light up very quickly because it's quite a dark... Thank you very much. This is quite a dark painting. This is one of the paintings from the Foundling Hospital courtroom, and it shows the paradox of representation involved in depicting an act of charity, which is one of the things I'm going to need to explore. This is Joseph Highmore's painting Hagar and Ishmael, depicting an episode from Genesis chapter 16, where Hagar is sort of Abraham's servant with whom he had an illegitimate child, Ishmael, who is here, and they were turned out into the wilderness. Now this is a painting for very, very, very prominent public display, but it depicts an unseen act. The whole point of what it's depicting here is that this is unseen. Hagar and Ishmael have been banished from society, and they are hidden from sight behind a bush, and only the angel of the Lord can find them out. That's sort of the whole point of the story, really. They're completely cut off from all human care. Only the angel of the Lord will look after them. And look at sort of how hidden away they are. There's nobody near. They're in a wilderness. So there's this sort of paradox of representing something that many people felt should actually sort of be taking place in private or even in secret. And we also see that theme in the many, many publications in the debate leading up to the 1834 New Poor Law thing. We could put the light back on now, thank you. It helps me read what I've got in front of me. Thank you. The many people who wrote in the debate leading up to the 1834 Poor Law were of the view that the people who put themselves forward for charitable relief most vocally were the people least in need of it. It's a really important and curious recurring trope in the late 18th century. Joseph Townsend, one of the spikier reformers who wanted to be sort of quite harsh in his reforms of the poor law system, he wrote, "It is generally found that modest worth stands at a distance or draws nigh with faltering tongue and broken accents to tell an artless tale, whilst the most worthless are the most unreasonable in their expectations and the most importunate in their solicitation for relief." So So let's just dwell there on this idea of standing at a distance, speaking with a faltering tongue, not being able to tell your story particularly eloquently. The truly needy cannot sort of perform worthiness and do not or cannot speak. So self-representation is suspect in this period. And all representation is a little bit suspect because it depicts a paradox. So let me move on to Dorothy and William Wordsworth. These are, as you know, major romantic authors and friends of Charles Lamb, who I mentioned a moment ago. They wrote some of the most vivid literary responses we have to the needy recipients of charity. First of all, in the Crantock Hills in Somerset, where they lived between 1797 and 1798, and later better known in the Lake District, where they lived in Dove Cottage in Grasmere, which is still home to the Wordsworth Trust. Dorothy is an interesting figure, always rather overshadowed by her brother, but she taught from a very early age in a charity school near where she lived at home, and she performed the social round of visiting the local poor and sick, relieving their wants with parcels of food and money and private tutoring, trying to educate the poor. She developed a shrewd eye for the community of itinerant mendicants and vagrants who formed part of the background of the late 18th century. They were a slightly separate group from the settled parish poor who were attached to a particular place. So you had people in need of charity who were actually sort of pinned, as it were, to their parish. And then the more slightly more sort of dubious category of vagrants who wandered from place to place, which they weren't supposed to do, it was illegal. And William Wordsworth drew extensively on Dorothy Wordsworth's journals for his famous poetry collection, Lyrical Ballads, first published in 1798. Has anybody read the Lyrical Ballads?
Many
years ago. Okay. And also again, Wordsworth drew again on Dorothy's journals for his epic poem Prelude, which he composed and revised indeed throughout most of his life, but which was only published when William Wordsworth died in 1850. He went on forever, Wordsworth. The golden rule with the Romantics is the earlier you were born, the later you died. They form a sort of their birth and death dates form a sort of rainbow, with poor Keats in the middle, who only lived for about 5 minutes. So Wordsworth drew very extensively on his sister Dorothy's sort of journal entries. So hopefully everybody has got a copy of this. This is one of the poems, this is the most famous poem, Way, from the Lyrical Ballads collection published in 1798, sort of co-authored with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but he didn't really do his fair share. I just want to draw your attention to the lines I put them on the screen here, actually, for convenience. Wordsworth talks about that best portion of a good man's life, and that best portion is described as his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Now, people who study the Romantics often dwell on the Romantics as writers of feeling, but it's interesting that Wordsworth explicitly talks about acts, so not just feeling that you're going to do good to somebody, but actually going on and doing it. So the best deeds you can do are these little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love, acts of charity, I think he's talking about there, in their various forms. And in contrast with the 18th century subscription list, public spectacle, blah blah model, it's interesting that Wordsworth emphasises the fact that these acts are little and nameless and unremembered. So the purpose of this poem is to describe how the beauty of nature cultivates fellow feeling, love for your fellow human beings, and how that will then manifest itself in these little nameless, unremembered acts. So if we look at the second bit of the stanza, Wordsworth has been looking at the beautiful scene of Tinton Abbey, which I'll show you in a minute, these forms of beauty, that's what he's talking about, these forms of beauty have not been to me as it is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them, in hours of weariness, sensations sweet. This is what these scenes of nature do for him. Felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration, feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as may have had no trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. So that is what the contemplation of natural beauty will do for you, and you can access that benign influence even when you are not physically there, when you recall it, pent up in a dark, smoky city garret. You can always go back there and rekindle that feeling, consciously or unconsciously. So, this brings us back to my point about paradox and dilemma. How can the poet, such as Wordsworth, or any artist, describe one of these acts without it ceasing to be private? As Wordsworth was obviously writing for publication, just as Joseph Heinwall was writing for his painting to be seen. But if our premium is on acts being little, nameless, and unremembered, there's a tremendous compromise, it seems to me, in putting them down in print and sending them out into the world. If you're doing it for some other motive, how can it be a pure act of sort of total sacrifice in thus found sense? It's sort of quite a complex question, and one that Wordsworth, I think, is quite aware of. I'm so sorry, could you turn up the light again, please, because this is one of the other visual element. At the root of all of this, the root of Wordsworth's poem is Tinton Abbey itself, which is here. This is a view from 1794, so roughly contemporary with what Wordsworth is writing about. This is the beautiful setting that inspires his feelings. Now, this is a Gothic ruin now. It's fallen into decay. It was famously painted by J.M.W. Turner and is often wheeled out as an example of romantic medievalism, of the romantic Gothic. Tinton Abbey played an enormously important part in the romantic period imagination. But it's a ruin, obviously. We're post-dissolution. Now, I put it to you that these buildings in the period retained a sort of aura. And just as the stone that was often taken from these buildings to build private houses, that removed the stone from the religious site and its proper purpose. And those houses often became the houses that were regarded as haunted houses, because the owner had sacrilegiously taken stone that was used for a good godly purpose and built a private house out of it. And that's sort of partly the origin of the haunted house story in the 18th century, the fact that these houses, all these abbeys that we read about in Gothic novels, have something sacrilegious about them. But for the stone that's left in its place, for its original purpose, that aura is more benign. And they retain, this building retains sort of the cultural memory of its original purpose as a centre of Christian almsgiving. And Townsend, who I mentioned earlier, he noted in his history of charity that the poor had always tended to congregate in the vicinity of these religious houses, but after the dissolution, the poor were scattered throughout the nation. And then were thrown on the charitable mercies of the population at large. William Gilpin wrote a near contemporary account of Tinton Abbey, and he actually went inside the ruins, and he found many homeless people there, many of them, dozens of them, living in the ruins, and they come to the place because they had a memory that it was a holy place, and that it was a place of shelter, and it was a place where they would be looked after. Even in this desperately sad sense of making a home underneath a bit of ruined abbey, that was still a place of relative safety. Wordsworth is often criticised for not mentioning this in his poem about Tinton Abbey, which is possibly unfair, because I think he was simply looking at it from a distance, sort of round about here. He didn't actually go into the ruins, but had he done so, that is what he would have seen. And one of the things I'm interested in is exploring Wordsworth's idea of reviving this cultural memory of sort of medieval or Gothic charity or whatever, which had been dismantled at the dissolution. And those obligations, those ultimately Christian obligations, have been transferred onto private citizens, such as himself. If we could please just put on the light. We see this in the poem. There's an extract of the poem on the reverse of this sheet. This is an example of what I mean. Here's Wordsworth's poem of the Old Cumberland Beggar. And he describes this person: the class of beggars to which the old man here described belongs will probably soon be extinct. It consisted of poor and mostly old and infirm persons who confined themselves to a stated round in their neighbourhood and had certain fixed days on which, at different houses, they regularly received charity, sometimes in money, but mostly in provisions. And this poem is very angry about William Pitt the Younger's attempts. He made some early attempts to reform the poor law system and the pauperist system, which fell by the wayside for the time being. But that's what Wordsworth is specifically talking about. And that's the statesman here who he's sort of addressing at the beginning. And here Wordsworth talks about the use, the social use that this beggar has. Deem not this man useless, statesman, ye who are so restless in your wisdom, ye who have a broom still ready in your hands to rid the world of nuisances, ye proud heart-swollen, while in your pride ye contemplate your talents, power, and wisdom, deem him, the beggar, not a burthen of the earth. 'Tis nature's law that none, the meanest of created things, of forms created the most vile and brute, the dullest or most noxious, should exist divorced from good, a spirit and pulse of good, a life and soul to every mode of being inseparably linked. Here's what the beggar means. While thus he creeps from door to door, the villagers in him behold a record which together binds past deeds and offices of charity else unremembered, and so keeps alive the kindly mood in hearts which lapse of years and that half wisdom, half experience gives, makes slow to feel, and by sure steps resign to selfishness and cold oblivious cares. That is what will happen to you. That's the risk of what will happen to you if these visible signs, such as the old class of beggar, are taken away, are removed from society. And where will they be put? They'll be put in, what do you call it? The house of industry. Elsewhere in the poem, Wordsworth puts in a plea to say, may never house misnamed of industry make him a captive. That was what may happen to the old Cumberland beggar if the political reforms that the statesman implemented went through. So I think Wordsworth's ideal is people who have giving money to the poor, and the poor or the recipients of charity in return teach the giver something, teach the giver how to live charitably and how to lead a better life. And Wordsworth seems particularly concerned that this should happen privately, almost in secret, that the little unremembered deeds. Whereas the House of Industry, a big sort of centralised institution, I don't know if you can see what's going on here, but this is a satirical cartoon of the House of Industry. And here are poor men sort of checking themselves in, and they're all sniffing these tubes over here. And the tubes are conveying the smell from the tables of the rich for the benefit of the poor operatives. So somewhere up there is a lavish charity gala dinner, and the smell is sort of coming down these charity tubes for the benefit of the operatives in the House of Industry. And Wordsworth is contrasting the sort of medieval ideal, the old cultural memory of charity, with the house misnamed of industry, in which the poor are shut away and fed by the rich, vaunting their wealth upstairs, for example, as a dinner, charity dinners, quite controversial in the 18th century. Once charity becomes a system like this, it ceases to be charitable because it is no longer personal. And this is, philosophically speaking, in terms of political philosophy. This is partly Wordsworth attacking the doctrine of utilitarianism, which was trying to think about how to make the poor useful, economically productive. And Wordsworth's example is how the old Cumberland beggar is morally useful, even if he is not economically useful and productive. So it's a slightly sort of different sort of narrative, but it's part of a wider argument. So that's more or less sort of it for the 18th century context. I was just sort of running through a couple of the concerns or chords this all struck with me when I sort of had my charity commission hat on, I suppose. If, and it's a big if, some of the features of the Georgian system, the great sort of mixed economy, sort of Rococo, coral reef system are sort of reappearing, or at least if charity is playing a larger role and sort of pulling a greater weight in society today than was perhaps the case in previous decades and centuries. We can talk about some of these concerns again. All the time at the Charity Commission in the world of sort of charity policy, there was the debate between whether charity is better at providing individually tailored services or whether it was better to have systematic provision on the grounds that it was fair and evenly doled out. And that debate still obviously isn't settled. There were loads and loads of cases where sort of charities were taking on public contracts. In fact, the Howard League was sort of meeting people at the prison gate to try to turn people's lives around and prevent them reoffending and so forth. And people said, no, it's unfair because if you do it for some, if the state's paying for this charity to do it for some people, you've got to do it for all. Everyone says, well, you're doing a good thing, but it's not sort of fair. It's not equal treatment. And that debate and that fundamental crux just sort of keeps pushing away in thinking about how charities can contribute. And if they can't help all, should they help some? So on and so on. And Wordsworth's concerns, this was the thing that always came up again and again at the Charity Commission, which he was always trying to nag the regulator into getting involved in sorting out, was about what happens when charities become very big. Charities do become very, very big, obviously. They sort of have large incomes, large numbers of staff, highly paid chief executives and so forth. And that makes quite a lot of people out there a bit uncomfortable. And again, if you want to look at the discourse attached to sort of complaints or comments or so forth, people kept saying that the charity sort of is less charitable once it's become a very, very large and bureaucratic organisation. And in the Public Trust and Confidence in Charities survey that Ipsos Mori does for the Charity Commission every 2 years, there's another one due out next year, the biggest concern that the public had was that too much is being spent on salaries and administration, and other people say, we don't know where the money goes. And those complaints attach themselves to very, very large charities disproportionately. And there was a sort of slightly romantic idea of the small neighbourhood charity that just sort of does wonderful good with no waste, no overheads. Every single penny goes to the end cause. That's the ideal. The big charities, of course, reply it's more complicated. Running a large organisation is complicated. You can't pretend it isn't. Also, thinking about the subscription list charity and Samuel Jackson Pratt. We got lots of complaints in, really, I think, about what you call sort of ostentatious fundraising occasions when people said, how can you spend all your money on sort of raising money or having gala events? It's all about gathering together in public and showing off. You don't really care about the people. It's a question of motivation. That one came up again and again. And it was interesting in the 18th century literature that complaint is always there because the 18th century was one of the great ages of charity dinners and people vied with each other to make them as extravagant as possible and serve things like turtle soup and other things which sort of considered great luxuries. And there seemed to be sort of suspicion surrounding this sort of where charity begins to overlap with high society, I suppose. Fundraising too, or just people soliciting charity in the general sense. That was an interesting one. Remember Townsend saying that the people who really need money won't come up to you and ask for it. They will stand back with faltering accents, if any accent at all, and the people who press themselves on you are probably the people who don't need it. And Townsend was very, very harsh about that, and he said the reason was that the genuinely needy are so weak from starvation that they can't get up and push themselves in your face or talk or tell a story, because if they can, they've obviously eaten well enough to have the energy to do that. Townsend was quite a hard line, but that sort of trope does appear again and again. The people who really need it are sort of modest and hide back. And this sort of intersects in an interesting way with, I think, concerns about fundraising in sort of Britain. There's quite a lot of people who don't like to be sort of as hassled or approached by fundraising, particularly in the street. 66% of people said that some fundraising techniques, and they were talking about face-to-face collections in the street, made them uncomfortable. People didn't seem to like it. And in Britain particularly, I think the less sort of effort you put into sort of confronting someone in the street, almost the more likely you are to get some money out of them, because that's just sort of the weird way we are. And another lesson I think the Wordsworth poetry can teach us is that even though there are very often periodically campaigns saying it is better to give money to a charity who will help the poor more responsibly and efficiently than if you just give money to someone in the street who might spend it on alcohol and drugs or something, or misuse it, the private individual encounter between the giver and the recipient is still of absolutely central importance to people's sense of what a charitable act is, I think, and it's not going to go away. So I think that campaigns to say you're better off giving your money to a charity, while very well-intentioned and perfectly logical, I don't think anyone's ever going to stop doing that, because there's just something about the sort of the one-to-one encounter that chimes with people when they think about what charity actually means. And just to finish off, it's interesting then that in contemporary sort of charity publicity, I think the designers are kind of onto that and use the publicity to sort of try to reproduce the private individual encounter as accurately as possible and downplay the sort of charity's role as intermediary. So here's the Centrepoint poster, which was sort of very, very widely seen last year, and it's still around this year. Just here is a person looking at you. All he wants is to be noticed. The poster is trying to just get you to have the sort of encounter there, and then almost surreptitiously, we're the people who'll do it. So no. And there again is here's another one for Find Families in Need. Here, a very sort of Wordsworthian emphasis again on faces, the sort of immediate plight of people, and the fact that this is happening in your community, it's on your doorstep, the primacy of that. So these posters are almost possibly trying to do something morally, aesthetically that Wordsworth was trying to do in his poetry, I think. They just struck a chord with me. Okay, and that was the end point.